Dzień dobry, dobry wieczór. Z tej strony Uba, Żaneta. Witam Was bardzo serdecznie na moim kanale. Dzisiaj, jak widzicie, po raz kolejny gości w filmie Nir. Witamy Cię serdecznie.
Dzień dobry.
I dlaczego Nir jest tutaj z nami? Wiele osób miało takie życzenie, żeby Nir opowiedział o historii Żydów z Jemenu. Dlatego, że wydaje mi się, że wiedza na przykład o Żydach Aszkenazyjskich, którzy pochodzą z Europy, jest o wiele większa, a ze względu na to, że w populacji Izraela Żydzi pochodzący z krajów arabskich to jest naprawdę duży procent. Rodzina Nira oczywiście pochodzi z Jemenu, z dwóch stron, także wydaje mi się, że to będzie idealna osoba, żeby o historii, o kulturze jemeńskich Żydów tutaj opowiedzieć. I dlatego Nir pojawił się dzisiaj u nas w filmie. Zanim zaczniemy, wspomnę tylko tutaj o kilku kwestiach. Możecie już od razu polajkować to wideo i zasubskrybować mój kanał, jeżeli jeszcze tego nie robicie. Koniecznie kliknijcie w dzwoneczek. Dzięki temu będziecie dostawać powiadomienia o każdym nowym filmie, który się tutaj pojawi. Druga kwestia jest taka, że możecie mnie i mój kanał wesprzeć na stronie internetowej Patronite. Link oczywiście też będzie w opisie na dole i za każde wsparcie serdecznie dziękuję. Dzięki Wam takie filmy jak ten na przykład mogą się tutaj pojawiać. Trzecia sprawa. Naszą rozmowę przeprowadzimy po angielsku, więc te osoby, które angielski znają, wszystko będzie w porządku, ale dla osób, które chciałyby mieć wersję polską, tutaj na dole będą się pojawiać napisy, także wszystko będzie, mam nadzieję, zrozumiałe. Nir, tak jak wspomniałam, Twoja rodzina pochodzi z Jemenu. Z którego dokładnie miejsca i jak oni się tutaj znaleźli w Izraelu?
My family is from Yemen and they arrived to Israel in the late 40s of the previous century. Which is a long time ago. In 1949, they are Jews that were lived in Yemen as part of a very ancient community of Jews that were living in Yemen for hundreds of years. My father's family came from a place called Rajuza. My mother's family came from, let's say, two different places of my grandmother and my grandfather. My grandmother came from a place called Dahre, and my grandfather came from a place called Beit al-Yazidi. I tried to Google these places and to see where they are located, and it wasn't easy because the description or the map of these places is not very clear. Of course, you don't see street view or anything like this, not even near that. Maybe main roads.
And you also had to Google that in Arabic, no?
Yes, I remember these places because my grandmother mainly used to repeat the name of these places, and the way she said the name of these places, I had to understand how to type it in Arabic, which I know how to do it, but it's not intuitive. It's not, if you mistaken by one of or this letter, you will not find the place. And it was a bit of a challenge to me, but I think I managed to put my finger on the map where these places are in Yemen.
A powiedz nam, jak właściwie Żydzi znaleźli się w Jemenie?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and there isn't a very clear answer for that. I was searching this a bit. We know that Jews were living in the place that back then, or even until today, some specify it as the land of Israel, which is more or less where Israel is located, and Yemen is pretty far away from Israel, and there are a few answers for this. Some of them are based on legends or some stories that people were telling. It's not, let's say, scientifically proven. I'm talking about 1,000 years before Christ or something like this. But there are evidence of Jews in Yemen, scientific, historical evidence for sure, pretty much for 2,000 years ago, something like that. So we are talking about a very, very ancient community that were spreading, I don't want to say all over Yemen, but in the cities, in the main cities there, and in remote villages as well there. So the Jews in Yemen weren't located only in one place, for example. There is an opinion or an approach that some of the Jews were actually converted from Islam to Judaism around the reign of the Queen of Sheba, which is 1,500 years ago, more or less, 1,500 years before Christ, that the Queen of Sheba went to visit King Solomon, and as she returned, a few tribes were, I don't know for what reason, agreed to convert to Judaism, as she admired him and said how big king he is or something like that. But again, this is only one of the theories.
Czy w Jemenie pozostali jeszcze jacykolwiek Żydzi?
As of today, I was reading that in Wikipedia, there are 4 Jews left in Yemen. 4 old Jews left in Yemen.
Where?
I don't know exactly where, but they simply don't want to leave Yemen and to go anywhere. And trust me, they've been offered a lot to go to the US, to Israel, anywhere, but they refuse to leave, and they are there, which means that let's say, this ancient and very interesting community of Jews in Yemen are about to finish.
A jakie były relacje pomiędzy Żydami a muzułmanami w Jemenie?
As of you may well know, Yemen is a Muslim country. The relations between Jews and the local Muslims, in general, they had their ups and downs. One thing that is important to know is that in the Islam, both the Jews and the Christians are considered to be the people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab in Arabic, which means the people that believe in one God. Since this belief of single God, monotheism, is very, very big principle in Islam, they recognize that both Christians and both Jews are believing in one God. So they gave them status that they are protected by the Muslim imam, let's say, in return for paying a tax, which puts them in the category of second class by definition, in one hand, and on the other hand, puts them in a state of being secured of their lives. This was more or less the situation of the Jews all over the Arab countries, Muslim countries, with 2 exceptions, that in these cases the Muslim imam of Yemen put the decision to the Jews there that either you convert to Islam or you are being killed. It happened twice, at least that we have records of that. Probably, or maybe it happened more, but 2 big occasions are known. The first one was in 1100, something like this. The second one is more known in 1679. It's called the Mausa exile. Why Mausa? Because the Jews were expelled to the desert in the southern place of Yemen, next to a city called Mausa. And this exile was the result of the Imam order that the Jews will be converted or killed. After big convincing efforts, which included a very, very, very big tax that he was being given, this Imam, He was convinced not to kill them, but to take a lot of money for each person that in return will not be killed and go to the exile. I'm calling it an exile, but actually only a quarter to third of the Jews in Yemen survived. The place that they were put was very remote, without water or food almost, and many died from diseases and very bad conditions, not to mention the animals, and like to be in the desert just like that out of nowhere. Many didn't survive this. So this happened for 1 year. After 1 year, in 1680, the Imam allowed them to return, and those who managed to survive returned, but they found out in many cases that their houses were taken. One thing very unique to Yemen is that according to the Yemenite law, any orphan must be converted to Islam. Way for the Jews not to, let's say, allow this situation, the solution for this was a bit strange. It was to marry the children. Announce this 5-year-old girl and 5-year-old boy as married. Of course, nothing happened other than this declaration, but this move put them out of the status of orphans, because now they are married, and a married person doesn't obligated to convert to Islam. Also, I remember my grandmother talking. She was born in Yemen. Yes, she would. We will talk about it soon. But she came to Israel when she was 20 or something like this, and she remembered very well the life in Yemen. And she said that in most of the cases they lived in the same neighborhood, and they were okay-ish, but they were always, the Jews were always realized that they are second class and they should not piss off too much the local Muslim, because the power is in their hand.
Czy wśród jemeńskich Żydów były jakiekolwiek świeckie ruchy, podobnie jak na przykład wśród Żydów Aszkenazyjskich w Europie?
One thing which is very different from the Jews in Yemen, from the Jews in Europe, for example, is that all the Jews in Yemen were, let's say, ultra-Orthodox to Orthodox. It wasn't a case of a person, let's say, that was defining himself or herself as secular. I believe that this is the result of, well, let's say, the culture that is part of this, that happened in this part of the world. This part of the world, which Yemen is part of, is the Arabic Peninsula. Until these very days is very religious and very fundamental. The secular movement, let's say, the reform movement that started in Europe in the 18th century, I believe, or something like this, that started the movement of going out from Orthodox life, religious, to a modern secular way of life, didn't happen in Yemen. I'm curious to know if today it is. I'm not so sure. But the Jews were part of the local environment, and they just were religious, very much religious, Orthodox, all of them.
Jaka jest różnica pomiędzy jemeńskim dialektem a standardowym językiem hebrajskim?
Many see the Yemenite pronunciation of Hebrew. When I say Yemenite, I mean Yemenite Jews' pronunciation of Hebrew as the most accurate Hebrew pronunciation. Mm-hmm. The difference is that Yemenite Jews pronounce Hebrew consonants and preserved it to their original way that it should be pronounced. For example, Yemenite pronouncing a consonant of ein, ein. If you hear that ein, it's from the the throat. The Ashkenazi pronunciation found it very hard.
It's impossible.
Yeah, and you guys can try it at home. Say ein, you succeed? Maybe, I don't know. Hope so. For Yemenite like me, it's very easy. Yeah? Many of the Ashkenazi, they say ein, ein. It's not as deep from the throat as ein. Okay. Similar is the consonants of het. Many find it very hard to pronounce het. It's again deep from the throat. So the Ashkenazi would say het, het. They can't. They find it hard to pronounce it. And you guys, and yeah, they pronounce resh, resh. For Polish, I believe it would be easy because it's like a rolling resh. And also the vowels in Yemenite are a bit different. It's the same sign of vowel as in Hebrew, but the Yemenite Jews pronounce it a bit differently. So this is very typical to the Yemenite Jews' Hebrew pronunciation.
Or could you give us an example, for example, a line from a prayer or blessing in the standard Hebrew and in the Yemenite Hebrew?
Yeah, I can sing that.
Okay.
אדוני אלוהים אשר מולך בחפשך אל יסיר נברו. And in Ashkenazi is אדון עולם אשר מלך בחפצו כל יציר נברא. If you repeat this and this and compare, maybe you would find it easier to see the difference.
Kiedy miała miejsce największa emigracja do Izraela, największa alija z Jemenu i dlaczego tak naprawdę to się stało?
So the Jews, as I mentioned, lived in Yemen for over centuries, and they were just fine, more or less, living there with the aspiration to one day come to Jerusalem as part of the, let's say, Messiah return. In the prayers, they were always mentioning that they want to come to Jerusalem. But they did nothing with that until the first wave of immigration from Yemenite in 1882. It also has a religious connotation, because this year 1882 is very similar to a verb in the Bible that is mentioning the letters, that if you play with the letters it results in 1882. So they came to Israel, to mainly Jerusalem. Part of them went and lived in what is now called Neve Tzedek, Roman Abramovich new place neighborhood.
Very expensive.
If you understand, nowadays is a very, very expensive place in Tel Aviv. It was a very poor and very dangerous place to live. It was another wave of immigration in 1907, again from religious perspective. And the next big waves of immigration occurred in 1949, which, as now you may all know, that this is when my grandparents came to Israel at this year. It was a very big operation conducted by an airline called Alaska that was operating in Alaska. It was an American airline that Israel hired this airline to bring the mass majority of the Yemenite Jews from Yemen to Israel on the planes. And the reason for the big mass immigration in 1949 was the establishment of the State of Israel 1 year earlier in 1948, and the result of the establishment of the declaration of the State of Israel was a very big tension between the Muslim Yemenites that didn't like the idea, what they see as a Muslim land inhabited by Jews, which is, according to the Islam, is something which is very not good, let's say. So they started to make a lot of problems to the Jews that were living in Yemen, and it came a very big operation. I believe like 50,000 people or something like that.
Jakie były różnice pomiędzy Żydami z Jemenu a Żydami na przykład aszkenazyjskimi, jeżeli popatrzymy na pierwsze lata po zrobieniu tej dużej alii?
When the State of Israel established in 1948 and it was decided to bring other immigrants, Jews, to Israel, what happened is that these people that came from Yemen were put in a very, let's say, bad conditions. And this is something which is a bit complex, because in one hand, we're talking about a very young country that was 1 year old, right after a very big war of independence, which took the life of a lot of people. The conditions were extremely bad, meaning they were put in tents if it was raining, if it was very hot. They were put in places without running water, not to mention electricity. But also the locations were in the sides of the towns and in a very near proximity to, let's say, Arab villages or Arab towns that these new immigrants were exposed to the attacks. There is a big thing that is related to the disappearance of young babies, which is until nowadays it is an open wound. Of course, that the years goes by and it's less remembered or not as hard as it was, but it's still a wound among the Jewish, the Yemenite Jews, that between the year 1948 and 1954, there was situation where about 1,000 babies disappeared. 2/3 of these kids were Yemenite, and it raised the question: what happened to them? The main thing that repeated itself is that Yemenite Jews came, a lot of families with a lot of children. Some of them were very sick, so the children were taken to the children's hospital, let's say. And when the mother or the father came after 1, 2, 3, 4 days to visit the child and to see how what's going on, he got the answer of the child is dead and we don't know where is the child. Of course, that the situation back then was very bad and the conditions were tough and babies died. How come 2/3 of them were Yemenite? I mean, what's so special in that? It was a lot of theories around it. One of the theories said that these babies were kidnapped by Ashkenazi young parents that couldn't have babies because of what happened in the Second World War. So they saw that the Yemenite families have, every family traditionally had at least 5, 6, 7 children. And they said, okay, they have so many children, let's take, because we can't have it. This is the theory, and it was being investigated 3 times by the State of Israel over the years. It wasn't found a case where a child was kidnapped and sent to other parents knowingly. The conclusions of these 3 committees over the years, it wasn't an institutional mechanism that allowed this to happen. However, there is an open question of what happened to these babies, because there is no grave and there is no documentation. The last committee granted something like 200,000 for each family, 200 shekels for each family that lost or didn't find the baby, so the authorities didn't give explanation. Okay, we received the baby, it's written that it was received, but we don't know what happened to this baby after 1 week. And this led to a very big, let's say, disappointment and mistrust of the Yemenite community in the establishment, let's say. It was on the background of a very big discrimination that part of it can be understood by the local, let's say, Ashkenazi people that met people that came from Arab country, that not all of them spoke Hebrew. The women didn't speak Hebrew because they weren't educated. The dresses, how they dressed, how they look, and the communication was very hard and very poor, and this led to discrimination. So in general, the Yemenite Jews that came to Israel granted a place to live. The conditions were, in most cases, were very, very tough.
Przejdźmy może teraz do kultury i sztuki. Czy możesz nam opowiedzieć trochę o tradycjonalnym jemeńskim ubiorze?
When it comes to clothing, Yemenite men were dressed Jews as the Muslims, and the same galabia, something on the head, the top. The men had this curly hair, side locks, which is curled like that. I don't have it, sorry. But this was the custom. The women were dressed also in a very, let's say, of course, modest, what we call modest way of all the bodies covered, all of the bodies covered. Depends in which part of Yemen. For example, my father's side, the women had this black piece of cloth around their head. Grandfather from my mother's side, for example, just had a scarf on the head, and that's it. One thing also unique for the Yemenite women is a piece of fabric which is very colorful, that is wrapped around the end of the leg with gold or red colors, which is very pretty, very beautiful. But also depends on which region in Yemen we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And if we look at it now, for example, we know that a lot of Orthodox women in, for example, New York or even in Israel or other countries, once they get married, they cover their hair with a wig. And that doesn't happen with Yemenite women. So
No.
What's the difference?
Yeah, so of course the wig is something very modern, and if we're talking about this specific part of the world, I'm pretty convinced that you will find very few wigs today.
Yeah.
So back then it just seen as something totally, I don't think they even knew about it much. But of course, it's something that requires a means of buying it, and we're talking about a very poor, in general, poor population, and also that the cultural environment didn't support that. It was ruled out by a Sephardi rabbi not to wear the wig because, and it makes sense, the wig, if it's a good one, it looks exactly like the hair, so what's the point? Even better than the hair. And the whole point is to cover the hair, not to make it even better. So it makes sense. If we look at what the occupation of the Jews in Yemen was, sadly, the women weren't allowed to have a profession. Maybe this is the time to point out that there was a very, very big hierarchy between men, which were allowed and entitled, to the women. And this reflects the situation of the region as well. So the women didn't have any occupation, and even worse, they weren't educated. So my grandmother, for example, never knew how to write her name even. The men, in Yemen, the Yemenite Jews, they were famous in making jewelry, and they did things related to trade with what is today Ethiopia, and back then it was called Habash. So I remember stories about my grandfather going from Yemen, traveling to Habash and doing some kind of business. I don't know exactly what. He wasn't rich at all, don't worry.
A jakie są specyficzne dla jemeńskich Żydów obyczaje związane z religią albo na przykład z kulturą?
One thing very famous for Yemenite wedding is that the bride in the ceremony before the wedding, which is called the henna, bride-to-be is wearing a very unique thing over her head with the shape of, I would say, like that, like this big. Yeah, it has a kind of triangle to the
We'll
top.
Put the photo somewhere here.
Yeah, which is covered with flowers, and only her face is visible, and all of the head is covered with this kind of thing, and she barely can move. My sister did that as some kind of tribute to this ceremony, and she said that she couldn't move her head because it's very heavy. There are also differences in the reading the Torah when they go to the synagogue. The ritual is slightly different from other Orthodox reading. The text is the same text, but the pronunciation is different, as we talked about. And also there is a small change of something additional that they give to a small child. Back then I did that, to read in what is Aramic language, the explanation of the Torah. There are also other things related to the religion that, for example, there is this fruit in the Sukkot that is similar to a big orange, but I don't know what's the name. How you say it? Etorog. It is a fruit that you can eat. It has a peel like the orange, but the shape is and the color is more greenish. And the Yemenite tradition is that this thing must be this big, while the Ashkenazi can have it. This is enough. Yeah, it's the same fruit. But the Yemenite, I don't know for what reason, really, and it's very heavy. If you carry it to the synagogue, for example, it's not convenient.
Okej, teraz bardzo, bardzo ważne pytanie. Ile żon może mieć jemeński Żyd?
A little bit of background before I answer this question. The Yemenite were living in a Muslim environment, the Yemenite Jews. According to Islam, a man entitled to marry up to 4 women at the same time. This was also the custom of the Jews, not only in Yemen, but in other countries. I'm not sure about 4, but more than 1. According to Judaism, back then, it was allowed. Around the year of 1000, a Jewish rabbi published the decision or the law that from now on it's not allowed for any Jew to marry more than 1 woman at the same time. And this was accepted by all over the Jewish communities all over the world, in Europe, in any other countries that Jews were living, but not in Yemen. They just didn't accept that. They continue the tradition to have more than 1 wife. My grandmother was the 3rd wife of her husband. Of course, nowadays is not allowed. It's not allowed since the Yemenite came to Israel in 1949.
Jakie są typowe potrawy dla Żydów z Jemenu? To jest nasz ulubiony temat.
Okay, so the Yemenite cuisine is based on a very basic ingredients, I would say. Most of the people didn't have much, let's say. Of course, there were the rich people, but most of the population were poor to this or that level. So the food is based on very basic ingredients, which results in a very tasty and amazing food. So the famous Yemenite food is called jachnun. It's a roll, flour and margarine and water that you roll it, and it's just amazing. I'm sorry.
It's very heavy.
You eat it, you eat it with squashed tomatoes and an egg. And also in Yemen, until today, it's very popular, the what is called schug, which is the spicy green thing that you don't want to eat too much because it will burn you. But it gives a small bite. There is the malawach, which is also based on the dough. The kubana, which looks like a bread, breadish and very oily thing, which is amazing to dip the soup or something like that in. The Yemenite soup, what we call, which is very basic, but the special thing in it is a herb or spice called the hawaij, which is a mixture of few spices, cumin, curcum, salt, pepper, all together mixed. It's called hawaij. You add it to the water, boil it, put the chicken, put the potatoes inside, leave it for like, I don't know, 2 hours. It's very, really nice. There is a very delicious thing called the sabaya. I don't think I ever mentioned that to you, but it's amazing. It is similar to malawach, but malawach is a kind of a dough, very oily, that you put on the pan. It's very crispy and nice. And the sabaya is a few layers of that, and it's that thick, and it's really tasty and totally not healthy, but really healthy. And you make it usually in religious holidays. This is why it's not very common, even for me. I didn't have it much. Lahuch. Try to pronounce it, by the way. Lahuch. Double het. This is something looks like pancake. It's made out of flour and water, basically, and you pour it on the pan, and you get this bubbly thing. I don't know how they make the bubbly thing. And it is very similar to the Ethiopian injera. Something also very unique to the Yemenite people is the khilba. The khilba is some kind of food made out of the grinds of some kind of herb. Very, very small grinds. You leave it in the water for a few hours, then you, like with the machine, just like that, and then it gets to be a creamy kind of thing. You put lemon, you put some bit of water, salt, and this considered to be a very healthy, not mythical healthy, scientifically healthy thing. That is very much common in the Yemenite cuisine, mainly with the soup, the Yemenite soup that I mentioned before. You put 1 or 2 spoons of this in the soup. It's very traditional thing, very unique to the Yemenite as well.
Now, when we talked about food, actually I have one question that came to my mind. What about substances?
I don't know how to treat that, so I would just say that. The Yemenite people, Muslim, Jews, whatever, in Yemen, very, 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 it's very popular to chew herb called gat or kat, depends how you pronounce it, which is a bunch of leaves that you make kind of a bowl, put it here, like that, and leave it a good 10-15 minutes, and this is a bit of a drug. I don't know, that's what it is. Not as, I don't know, cocaine, it's not the same level, but it has some kind of, how you call it, active thing in it. You will find even until today, it's illegal to sell it in the market.
But people have.
But people have it in the Yemenite people, they have it, they found
bags.
the way to grow it in their own, because that's just tradition, okay? It's not, they're not junkies or something. That's the tradition, yeah? But what can I say about it? It's very bitter, but it's doing something. Yeah, it is. There is something in it.
Czy możesz nam trochę opowiedzieć o muzyce Żydów z Jemenu?
The Yemenite Jews in Israel produced a very successful singers. Most popular one that you might heard of is Ofra Haza. There is also a very famous singer called Zohar Argov.
Should wear the t-shirt.
Yeah, maybe in previous video I was wearing his t-shirt. I don't know if I did that. He is called the king of the Mizrahi music in Israel. He lived in the 80s. And he back then was a bit not popular by the establishment and the radio, but today he passed away, and today is very recognized as very important. There are other singers very popular like Boaz Sharabi, Shoshana Damari, and others that are very famous for the voice, for the special pronunciation of the lyrics. There are actually a group of, I believe, 3 women, young women. I forgot the name of this.
I think I know which song.
Aywa, Ahwa.
Yeah.
I forgot. They sing in traditional Yemenite songs.
This is the one that once we saw the video of the Egyptian soldier dancing to it and the Israeli soldier dancing to it. Yeah. It's very popular at the parties. Even in Poland I heard the song at the parties.
Really?
Yeah. Którzy Żydzi z Jemenu na stałe zapisali się na kartach historii Izraela?
For the Yemenite in Israel, the most, let's say, recognized and admired figure is a person called Rabbi Shalom Shabazi. He was a very famous poet in Yemen in the 17th century. And he was writing poets about, of course, the love of God and the Kabbalah influence and philosophy. And upon his name, there are places in Israel like streets or the neighborhood in Neve Tzedek next to in Tel Aviv. There is a long street upon his name. One thing very, let's say, sad, if you know the Prime Minister of Israel back then was Yitzhak Rabin. He was assassinated in 1995 by a Yemenite religious Jew. So I'm not proud of it. But one thing that I can say about it, which is not 100%, but this is my interpretation or a little bit of context that I would give. It's not surprising for me that the killer was from Yemenite background in a way. I'm not justifying it and I'm not saying it's obvious that it was Yemenite, not at all. I'm just saying that because of the fundamental orthodox cultural environment that the Yemenite people back then lived in this specific place of the world, I'm not shocked it happened that one of these Yemenite were prone to such extreme ideology to the level of killing the Israeli prime minister.
Okej, ostatnie pytanie teraz. Jak wygląda sytuacja Żydów jemeńskich w tym momencie w Izraelu?
The Yemenite, let's say, origin people, Jews that living in Israel are assimilating naturally in the general culture in Israel. So they marry non-Yemenite, and some of them still do, but it's not going to last physically. I mean, in the next, 50 years, 100 years, I don't think it would be even something very much like Yemenite origin, that the grandfather and grandparents are Yemenite like 100%, I am. Yeah. So it's going to end. It's going to end physically, but I'm sure that the tradition and the culture would be preserved by people that would like to keep at least part of it.
Okej, dziękuję Ci bardzo za podzielenie się ze mną i z naszymi widzami tą całą historią, kulturą, opowieścią i wydaje mi się, że jest to dla nas niesamowicie ciekawe poznać takie szczegóły właśnie od osoby, która z tej kultury się wywodzi. Jeżeli spodobało Wam się to, co Nir powiedział, jeżeli chcecie mu podziękować za to, że dzisiaj dla nas wystąpił, koniecznie musicie kliknąć łapki w górę, tak jak mówiłam na początku filmu, zasubskrybować ten kanał klikając w dzwoneczek, napiszcie w komentarzach na dole pod tym filmem podziękowanie dla Nira, będzie mu na pewno bardzo miło, albo jakieś pytanie, jeżeli macie do niego i może w przeciągu kolejnych tygodni albo miesięcy nagramy kolejny film. Jeżeli macie jakieś tematy, na które Nir mógłby Wam opowiedzieć albo odpowiedzieć na Wasze pytania, jesteśmy bardzo otwarci na to.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope it was interesting for you.
I ostatnia rzecz, możecie wesprzeć kanał na stronie internetowej Patronite. Dziękuję bardzo serdecznie wszystkim osobom patronującym i oczywiście możecie dołączyć do tego zacnego grona. Wszystkie szczegóły będą pod linkiem w opisie na dole. Możecie mnie odwiedzić na moich innych social mediach. Jestem na Facebooku i na Instagramie, gdzie staram się być trochę częściej niż na YouTubie. Dziękuję Wam jeszcze raz za uwagę. Dziękuję Nirowi jeszcze raz za informacje. Proszę bardzo. I do zobaczenia w takim razie w kolejnym filmie. Żegnamy się z Wami. Pa!
Bye.